hand over to him now to let him introduce himself.
Hi, Caroline. And hi, everybody. This thriller crime book is about, it's called The Rhino Conspiracy, published by Muswell Press.
Yeah, got it. Do you want to tell us a little bit about it?
Yep, it started really, it was conceived about 5 years ago. I was visiting with Elizabeth, my wife, a game reserve in South Africa called Tula Tula. I don't know if any of you read The Elephant Whisperer, but it's a marvelous book about the owner's relationship with this herd of rogue elephants. And there were rhinos in the game reserve. It's in KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa. And they were chomping peacefully on the grass, and there were 2 armed guards with them 24/7, and we could see them. The rangers pointed them out. And then we heard how poaching kills these regal specimens with bullets that explode inside them and destroy them. And then the poachers come along and use machetes, or pangas as they're called in South Africa, and hack out their horns. And then they're exported usually to Vietnam or China, sometimes Hong Kong, other countries in East Asia, and ground down. And the powder is used for all sorts of rich people's delights. You might call it obscene delights, in my view, like cocaine substitutes and even aphrodisiacs, apparently, and various other pursuits. And they fetch a lot of money on the international market, and there are crime syndicates, often backed by corrupt politicians. So this book's really about that kind of story. And I was also becoming aware around 5 years ago of the terrible corruption in South Africa that was destroying Nelson Mandela's legacy and his vision and his integrity. And all the values of the freedom struggle against apartheid. And so I decided to write the thriller, The Rhino Conspiracy, which is published this week by Muswell Press, and to illustrate that behind poaching of these different species, but mainly rhino and also elephants, then are international crime syndicates and corrupt politicians backing them up. And this thriller is really is a story about that, and about how people try to fight that, and the danger they go through, and the tension and the conflict and the threats to their lives. That's what the thriller is essentially all about.
Now, I was lucky enough to get a copy to read in preparation for this interview, and it is a really good book. And I've got several questions before we go to the ones on the stream that I got from reading it.
Right.
So you mentioned a sort of American veterans who use their military tech to help protect the endangered species in the novel, and I didn't know if that was fictional or something that was real.
No, there is an organization called Vetpor, which is about American veterans who use their military techniques and work for a charity, and they often send these guys into game reserves at the request of the game reserves to work with the rangers, because as one of the rangers in the thriller describes it, and this was a phrase used by one of the rangers actually in the game reserves that we visited. He said it's a war zone, and I think people often don't really understand how it's an armed battle between the poachers, often usually actually poor African poachers, local men with families they can't feed, who are easy recruits for these international crime syndicates. And they use them, and they come in to try and kill these rhinos, in this case, get their tusks, but they then often kill the rangers or are killed by the rangers. And so there is this kind of armed conflict going on, which is depicted in the thriller as well, a whole series of incidents. And one of them involves these guys from Vetpor who are brought into this game reserve as they have been in other ones, to try and assist the Rangers, who are just losing this battle.
The other thing I wondered about was you've got two sort of really striking characters in your book that don't have a name. They're just the veteran and the sniper. What made you choose not to name them?
Well, they're based on real people. The sniper is somebody whom I met, and his biography is approximately correct. Obviously, you're talking about fictional characters, so you've got license to develop them and make them into the people you want them to be for the thriller. And in the case of the vet, and he was a military sniper, retired, and the story in the book is about how he is persuaded by the owner of this reserve, who knew him from his military service back in the old apartheid days, enlists him to try and help to resist this wave of poaching that they can't deal with. The veteran is one of Nelson Mandela's disciples, one of his lieutenants, who is a freedom fighter during the long, bitter decades of the battle against apartheid. And I don't give them names because they are based on real people. The entirely fictional characters are usually given names in the book.
They really felt very real people. As you
Did they?
read them.
Oh,
They were
good.
even though they didn't have names, you found yourself really engaged with them and interested in like their background and their story.
Well, good, because in the case of the sniper, this is a former military sniper who's, as I say, then enlisted to help defend this game reserve from this wave of poachers. But he's conflicted because his job as a military sniper was to act on behalf of the state. And that's what soldiers do. They feel they're doing their duty by their country. Well, here what he's doing is brought into, in quotes, a war zone in a wildlife context, and he's having then to kill people who are the poachers and stop them killing the rhinos. And you probably, the dialogue between him and the veteran, particularly when the story hots up, is I hope a real one about the conflict in his emotions about whether what he's doing is correct.
You also have had a really varied and interesting career. How much of that helped inspire the book? Because I'm sure there were some names that I recognized when you were mentioning people who helped in the struggle. And
well, yes, I mean, my childhood was in South Africa. I mean, I'm 70 years old now. So in the late 1950s and early 1960s, I lived in Pretoria, and my parents were very brave white anti-apartheid activists. And our house was continually raided by special branch officers from the apartheid security police. And my mother and father were jailed when I was 11 years old, woken up in the early hours of the morning to be told that they'd been snatched away. They were never actually tried because they couldn't find evidence against them, but they nevertheless detained them for 2 weeks. And then they were issued with banning orders, which stopped them being active and had various other restrictions, some of which I touch upon in the book when I'm describing different characters. And some of those incidents in the book are based on real life ones. Like, for example, there's a judge who plays a role in the thriller, in a judge in the Constitutional Court. Well, he's based on a real person. I name him in this case. I give him a fictional name, but he's based on somebody that my mother helped when he was a young teenager in court in Pretoria in the early 60s, and he rose to a very high level in the Constitutional Court of South Africa. So there's a lot of my experience in the book. Yes, there is indeed.
We've got a lot of questions on the stream. One of them does talk about your career. It says you've had an interesting career. What are you most proud of?
Two things, I think, probably. One is I found myself as a 19-year-old leading a campaign to stop all white South African sports tours, particularly Springbok rugby tours, because in those days, unlike the Springbok team that won the Rugby World Cup last November under the leadership of a black captain, the Siya Kolisi. In the days of apartheid, if you weren't white, you couldn't play for your country. And I decided as a young activist with a number of colleagues that what we needed to do was disrupt these matches. So in the winter of 1969-70 in Britain, because meanwhile my dad had been stopped working in South Africa by the apartheid government, and we had to come into exile in Britain. And I got together some activists, and we started running on the pitches and invading them and stopping the matches. And we did succeed in stopping the 1970 all-white South African cricket tour by that non-violent direct action, the threat of it rather. And I'm very proud of that, because that's helped seal white South Africa's isolation from international sport. And the other thing I'm most proud of, I suppose, in a long career in politics of over 50 years is being part of the negotiations in Northern Ireland that brought the old enemies, Ian Paisley from the Protestant Unionist side and the former IRA commander from the nationalist Catholic side, Martin McGuinness, these bitter old enemies, to share power together and help cement in the peace settlement. And I negotiated that. I helped negotiate that, so I'm proud of that as well. A lot of other things, but I suppose those are the two highlights.
Two of the questions that we got before we went live were from my dad, who's the founder of the group. Right. He said, what job did you most enjoy in government?
It was the Northern Ireland job. When I was in the cabinet for 7 years. I was an MP for a quarter of a century, MP for the South Wales former mining constituency of Neath. And then I was during that, for those 24 years, half of that was spent in government, the government of Tony Blair and Gordon Brown. And 7 of those years were in the cabinet. And the highlight for me was in Northern Ireland, because to make a contribution, without exaggerating it, to history, to help to bring peace and stability to an island of Ireland that had been torn by conflict and horror for centuries. And it's still not completely resolved. There's all sorts of bumps and scrapes along the way, but that was something that I'm proudest of in government.
And his other question was, what do you think you would have done had you not gone into politics?
Oh, well, when I was a small boy, Caroline, I thought I wanted to be a Formula One racing driver, but I can't imagine I'd have ever managed to do that. I'm a Lewis Hamilton fan and follow motor racing as I do football and other sports, but I don't know what would have happened to me. I really don't. I mean, I didn't plan a career. People of your kind of age sometimes come to me, young people say, could you advise me on my political career if they're interested in politics? And I say, well, I can't really, because I didn't expect to be an MP. When I was an MP, I didn't expect to be a government minister. When I was a government minister, I didn't expect to be in the cabinet. And I certainly didn't expect to end up in the House of Lords, where I've been for the last 5 years. So in terms of advice, I think the most important thing is to stick to your values and your principles. Try to do that. And that's important for all of us in whatever we do in our lives. And none of us are saints, and I'm certainly not. But I think that's the most important thing, certainly in politics, is trying to stick to your principles. And it's hard at times, because life involves compromise, and politics involves a lot of it.
So this book is your first move into fiction, but you've got quite a variety of other books to your name.
I have, yes. I've written over 20 books and edited a couple amongst those. But writing a thriller is very, very different. And I read a lot of thrillers. I read crime for enjoyment. I mean, I like thriller writers like Gerald Seymour, for example, who's a great thriller writer. I'm David Baldacci, the American crime writer. I've just got into James Patterson and Sam Bourne. Before that, earlier ones that I like were Craig Thomas, for example. And I read a lot of them and enjoy them just for a break from the kind of heavy stuff that I tend to have to read. And I thought, well, I'd try I tried to see whether I could, write one myself, and the Rhino conspiracy is the product of that.
I feel like the Rhino conspiracy is also sort of drawing on a lot of your experiences. But if someone reads that and is sort of drawn into the issues that you talk about with the rhinos, is there things that they can do or people they can engage with to help?
Well, immediate thing that people can do, and I hope that those who read the book might do it, is to support the Save the Rhino charity, because it does really important work, and you're fighting to preserve a species, and this is not just the extinction of species, and there are a whole series of species that are just becoming extinct as a result of climate change, result of our behavior as a human race. We're the most destructive species on the planet in the history of the planet. And so, I mean, if readers are particularly engaged by this threat to the rhino species, because tens of thousands of them have been killed over the decades, and they're still being killed every year in Africa, in the main, some in Asia as well, but mostly in Africa. I think Save the Rhino do fantastic work. There are other wildlife charities as well, but that's the one I would say have a look on their website and sign up.
Great. We've got some comments as well coming in. I think this is my dad. I can't see it. It says Facebook user. He says he clearly remembers your activities from the late 60s into the 70s. You should be so proud.
It's very kind of you, Dad.
It's called David.
David, well, it's very kind of you, David. Well, it wasn't easy. People say, well, Nelson Mandela walked out of prison and apartheid was replaced by a non-racial democracy, and that's true. But it was a very hard battle. It didn't happen overnight. It took many decades, and lots of people made sacrifices, including, I'm proud to say, my parents, who gave up the country of their birth and their life and their friends and relatives, and neither could go to their parents' funerals because once we came into exile, we're not allowed to go back. It was a hard struggle. People were killed. I myself got a letter bomb sent to me by the South African security police as a result of my anti-apartheid activities, of which your dad David refers. And fortunately, there was a fault in this letter bomb, and it didn't go off. But similar letter bombs killed a lot of other anti-apartheid leaders. So it was a very tough battle.
We did have a question related to this. It says, how did you find moving from South Africa to the UK at such a young age? That's
from Samantha, I think.
It is, yeah.
Nice to meet you virtually, Samantha. Well, I kind of took it. It was something that was happening, and my parents said, "You're now British." We were able to adopt British citizenship through my grandfather, who was from Glasgow, my dad's parents, and he said, "Apartheid's not going to end quickly. This is 1966 when I was 16." And it's important you get involved in the community, and we're not going back. I don't know when apartheid's going to end, but it won't be soon, and it wasn't. It took over a quarter of a century still, for 30 years from that time, more or less. And unlike a lot of other exiles in the anti-apartheid struggle who lived, and it's not a criticism of them, it's simply a statement of fact, found it very tough exile. And my younger brother and two sisters found it much tougher than I. I just kind of got my head down and got involved and ended up where I ended up. But it wasn't easy. You give up all your friends, you're not going to be able to go back. You don't see your grandparents, you don't see other relatives. And it's hard moving to a new country, not out of choice, but because you have to. Though I will always be grateful for Britain to giving us a safe birth.
Tell us a little bit about your launch events that you've got planned for the Rhino Conspiracy.
Well, Muswell Press, who are the publishers of the Rhino Conspiracy, I'll just show it to you again. They have got a launch on Thursday, it's a virtual launch in Daunt's bookshop, in the Marillion bookshop. It was going to be actually in the bookshop. They're one of the most prominent independent booksellers, and booksellers are having a very tough time, have had for years, but are particularly have had a tough time during COVID. So there's a virtual launch of that at 7 o'clock. And if you go on Muswell Press's website, then you'll be able to see how to attend it, if that's what you'd like to do.
You've got some other events, haven't you, like Good Morning Britain and things lined up as well?
Yes, various media interviews. I've done a number of podcasts and media interviews, and invitations to do that in various newspapers. There's always a feeling, and I'm sure this is true for other authors, on the eve of the publication of your book, you've worked very hard, the publishers have invested in it, and then you wait to see whether anybody buys it. Fortunately, the orders for it seem to be encouraging. The number of bookshops and outlets and Amazon and so on and Waterstones that have taken copies to sell is encouraging, and the response so far has been encouraging. But I have to wait to see what the reviewers make of it, and whether it's treated in a favourable way or not, and whether people want to read it. I hope they do, because obviously it's my book, and I wouldn't I? But I like to think, and I don't know what you felt, Caroline, but I like to think it's as one of the endorsers said, is a page turner that draws you through, and it's an easy read, which was important to me. I don't know what you feel about it, but that's important, to try and make it an easy read.
I found it a really intriguing read, because I'm not very politically aware. I'm going to be very honest about that. Yeah. I don't watch a lot of news and things. Some of the things I had to go away and look up and learn as I read, but then that actually I felt was really worthwhile, and it made me enjoy the book more.
Right.
If that makes sense. And I found myself sort of learning a lot more about you as well through reading your book.
Okay. I suppose there's a bit of me in it. And I think it's David who's asking, how do we buy a signed copy? And Daunt's have got signed copies by me, Daunt's Bookshop. That's DAUNTS. I'm sure your followers and those on this interview and event will know about Daunt's, but they've got signed copies.
Yeah, we're big fans of independent bookshops.
Yeah, they're so important. Your local bookshop, if you're lucky enough to have one, is so important. It's easy for any of us to use Amazon or Waterstones or any of the online ones, and Waterstones are a very important bookseller as well, obviously. But your local bookshops are critical if you can support them.
Are there any events that you're looking forward to attending once you're able to?
Well, I take part in debates, as I am this week, virtually in the House of Lords, and it'll be interesting the House of Lords is operating in a hybrid fashion at the moment, so you can contribute, as I will do, in a series of speeches this week on bills and questions and so on, virtually, in the way that I'm talking to you. But it'll be, I'm looking forward to the House, to Parliament coming back in a way that I've been used to for 30 years as a member of Parliament, mostly in the Commons and then in the Lords. But to be frank, I'm not sure it's going to, in quite the way that any more than I think our lives are going to go back to normal, whatever that means. I think it's going to be a new kind of normal for the foreseeable years.
How much of a say did you have in the cover and the title of your book?
The say on the title of the book, that was jointly agreed between Sarah and Kate Beale, who are wonderful, experienced publishers who set up Muswell Press, which is a relatively new publishing venture, but they're very experienced and respected in the publishing world. And it was agreed readily between us. And they've been great to work with, very enthusiastic, highly professional, and very sympathetic, but also, they've got a tough editorial cutting edge, which is what you need in publishing, to publish books of quality, as I hope readers will find this one.
What about the cover design?
Oh, the cover. No, that was designed by. I'll take another chance to have a look at it. I think it's a great cover.
It is a really good cover.
And their artist and cover designer with them designed it. So I think it's very evocative, actually, of what the story is about. So no, I didn't have anything to do with the cover. I was sent it to approve, and I was thrilled by it, frankly.
Do you have any more things in the works?
Well, one of the editorial and publishing team was sorry, this sounds immodest, but loved the thriller so much that she said that I should think about writing a sequel. I'll see how this goes, but it's made me think about that. I mean, I don't know whether you identified as a young woman yourself, Caroline, with one of the characters called Tundi, which is an African name and literally translated means the loved one, and she's the heroine of the whole story. And Fiona, who's on the team promoting the book, she liked her a great deal and wants to know what's going to happen to her next. We'll see. That's up to Muswell Press as to whether they want a sequel or not. But a lot of effort went into writing this. It's much harder, to be frank, than writing nonfiction, which is what the 20 other books that I've written are.
You do have a nonfiction coming out soon, though, don't you?
I do. Yes, I do. I've co-authored with a great historian of South Africa, particularly sports historian, a good friend of mine called Andre Oudendal, who lives in Cape Town. I've co-authored a book called Pitch Battles, which is the story of the anti-apartheid in sport campaign, but it's a wider account also of the way that sport and politics have collided over the decades. People tend, I'm a sports fanatic myself. I'm a Chelsea football supporter. I hope that doesn't put off any readers who are supporters of other clubs, or potential readers. And I'm a motor racing fan, as I said, and a rugby and cricket fan. And people who follow sport as avidly as I do tend to see it in an entirely different world from politics. But this shows actually from the way that Hitler used the Nazi Olympics to the way that the Black Lives Matter movement, which is so important, I believe, has actually gone. A lot of sports people have taken up the cause, including professional footballers like Raheem Sterling of Manchester City and Marcus Rashford of Manchester United. So it tells that whole story. It's called Pitch Battles, being published by Rowman and Littlefield. I hope in November. It's been in production, but it's been affected by COVID.
So do you have ideas for follow-ups to the Rhino conspiracy? Because you do need to tell us more about the young.
You think so, do you?
Yeah, well, you do. I want to know more about what happens to the people in the...
Tell me why, Caroline. It's a matter of interest.
I think there was a lot in the story that was really interesting, and the characters felt very real and complex and intriguing, and there are some of them that just don't have all of their stories told.
Oh, that's very kind of you
to say. You feel like there's more to come from them.
More to come. Yes, yeah. I think there probably is. But what I have to be certain about, if Muswell Press do want me to write another one, is that I can produce something that I hope somebody like you, who's a very discerning reader, will find is equally interesting, and that the characters are equally compelling, because there are a whole number of them, and proper thriller writers, like some of the ones I've mentioned, who turn out a thriller once a year, or certainly once every couple of years. And that's their professional job. That hasn't been my professional job. And and they can produce these books with characters that are interesting. Some are characters that go on through the books, but others are entirely fresh and new. And I'd have to be certain, and I think Muswell Press would have to be certain that I was capable of doing that.
But some of the really intriguing parts of the book are the way that you use the politics. So the things like they use the parliamentary privilege to get information out and things like that. That's an advantage you have over other thriller writers, in that you know a lot about how those things work.
Yes, in the case of parliamentary privilege, this, of course, is an ancient right that parliamentarians have. When speaking in Parliament, you speak under, quotes, privilege, which means that it's a precious right, actually, basic part of our freedom, and originally was supported by the Bill of Rights, and goes back to the 17th century. And when the king tried to curb and muzzle MPs who were criticizing what was going on, what he was doing. And if you exercise parliamentary privilege, other than routine speeches, you've got to do so with a lot of care and integrity and principle, because you can't be sued. So if some of the things that I have said under privilege, for example, I named the businessman Sir Philip Green, who'd been accused of, there were all sorts of allegations of harassment of various kinds, and that was widely covered in the newspapers after I named him. But he had managed to keep his name out of the papers by a non-disclosure agreement, a secret agreement, which I thought was an abuse of that system. And so I named him. I didn't do it gratuitously or at all casually. And there have been a couple of other occasions when I've used it, including as the British MP, Member of Parliament, who's another character in this book, does, exposes a lot of the corruption around the rhino poaching in the thriller, in the book. And I have done that myself. And I did it exposing corruption in South Africa under the former President Zuma, before he was toppled. And there's a president in the Nelson Mandela tradition now holding that office in South Africa, President Ramaphosa, who's trying to clean the thing up, clean the country up. But so, yes, you'd have probably got us an insight into how that works and the kind of insider view, and that came directly from my own experience.
How much research, apart from obviously things that you're an expert in, did you have to do for the book?
A lot of research, particularly into wildlife, which I'm not, and poaching as well, which I'm not an expert in. I described how the experience of visiting the game reserve, which Elizabeth and I have done on a number of occasions, and in this case 2015, and being horrified at learning about poaching. I mean, I knew about poaching like we all do, but hearing it from the rangers in first-hand terms, and seeing the rhinos and the elephants there in the reserve, just trying to live their lives as humankind seeks to attack them. And I then started to read about it. And when I had the idea of writing this book, I read particularly, there's a great book called Killing for Profit by the wildlife expert Julian Rademeyer, who's a South African, and it is a chilling account. It's of global poaching and the extent of it, because as I said earlier, you've got local poachers, often poor Africans trying to feed their families. That's not in any way justifying them, but they're desperate for income of any kind. They risk their lives. And then higher up the chain, you've got these organized crime syndicates, often protected by corrupt politicians. Otherwise, the poaching would be incidental. But it's actually organized crime. It's on a scale of drug trafficking and human trafficking, and sometimes the personnel overlap. So I had to do a lot of research into that. And I think reading thrillers as I do, there's obviously a lot of research goes into them, and crime books generally, although it's fiction, a lot of real life research has to go into it, whether it's the places that they're set in, or whether it's the background to them.
Did any of your research surprise you?
Surprise me? I think I hadn't appreciated the extent of big organized crime behind poaching. That was a bit of a surprise, and I hadn't been aware of the sheer horrific scale of poaching, and how human beings. I mean, what on earth are people grinding down rhino horns for cocaine substitutes for? Why are people doing this? It's rich sort of playboy types of people who've just got too much money, or as to take with alcohol, or as aphrodisiacs, for example. I mean, why are people doing this? And I suppose that shocked me. I hadn't really appreciated because in the end, poaching happens because somebody's paying for it. And at the end of this crime chain, often sheltered by corrupt politicians, and a lot of the organized crime poachers at the top of the tree are protected and pay backhanders to have that protection. A lot of them, in the end, it only works because people, consumers of, in this case, the powder from ground down rhino horns, or in the case of elephants, their tusks and the ivory for all sorts of trinkets and other things. In the end, it is people who pay the money that feed the crime syndicates, that pay the local poachers, that kill the animals. It's rather like heroin users or cocaine users. If you use those drugs, then you are at the consumer end of a long chain that is often, is run down on the ground by mafia type criminals.
So if you were to write a follow-up, would you choose another? There's an example on here that's come from my dad that says Peter May wrote a book called Coffin Road that was designed to draw the attention to insecticides and the harm done by them.
Right.
Like a thriller. So would you choose another thing like the rhinos for a follow-up book, do you think?
If I did, it would probably be in the same territory about elephants, because I think elephants are the most intriguing animals on Earth, actually. They're incredibly intelligent. And I tell, for example, the story in this game reserve, you may remember it, Caroline, from the book, about the owner being killed, the owner of this reserve, where the poaching takes place, dying, and the elephants that he'd befriended actually coming to his house as if they were attending a funeral, and showing all the signs that elephants show when they're grieving deeply for, usually for one of their own in the herd, but in this case it was him. And their intuitive umbilical bond to him was extraordinary. And that's a real life story that he wrote about in the it is a real life story. So I think if I did, it would probably be if it was in the same territory, if I had time to research it.
So you also worked with the UN. You were on the UN Security Council.
I was, when I was Britain's Minister for Africa. This was in 1999 to 2000. I was in the Foreign Office, covering Africa, the Middle East, and South Asia, as well as the United Nations. and the Commonwealth and a number of other things. But Africa was very high on the agenda of the Security Council in those days. The United Nations Security Council, of course, is the executive body of the United Nations, and it has the power of international law if it makes decisions, can impose sanctions and take other acts. And I chaired it on a number of occasions when Britain. It's a rotating presidency. When I was chair of the Security Council, Britain, of course, is one of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, along with China and Russia and America and France. So that was really interesting, and negotiating international treaties on nuclear disarmament, and on one that I actually originated was getting rid of blood diamonds. Well, trying to make the diamond trade legally, to give it the legitimate legal trade, to make sure that diamonds were not coming from conflict zones, fueling bloody wars, as was the case when I became Minister for Africa. I discovered this from intelligence, and I initiated a process that resulted in the international treaty, United Nations treaty, sometimes known as the Kimberley process after a town in South Africa, which is a diamond mining area.
That's really fascinating. Would that be something you'd be tempted to use as like future material? Because there has been thrillers and things written about blood diamonds.
They have, and a couple of films made about them. I think there was a particularly good film that I liked, that Leonardo DiCaprio starred in, and I was quite impressed because as a Hollywood big shot, he actually got the South African accent pretty good, and it's a difficult accent too. I mean, I have a very mild one now. You can probably hear traces of it because I moved to Britain when I was 16, but it's a difficult accent to master for actors and actresses, and he did it very successfully. I mean, that might be another area. You're giving me all sorts of ideas, Caroline, but we will see.
I'm trying to encourage you to write more, you see, because I enjoyed the first one so much. If we keep giving you ideas, you might go back. So there was a question from Sam earlier on who said, what books do you like to read when you were growing up?
Well, when I was growing up, I liked, when I was a boy, I liked, the sort of normal books of people of my generation in the 50s and early 60s, Famous Five and Enid Blyton and The Secret Seven when I was very young. And also I liked Biggles, and those were the main ones. And then, yeah, I think probably those are the main ones that I read. And then as I got a bit older, I started reading thrillers in my teens, and I've never stopped.
Do you have any plans to attend any literature festivals?
Well, I have attended literature festivals. I've been privileged to be invited to probably the biggest the Hay Festival, a number of occasions on other books over the past decade. But of course, they're all happening virtually at the moment, and I am doing a number of them, and maybe more will follow. But it's obviously very tough for literary festivals, and they're terribly important for the book trade, as you will know. And they're great events to attend. And I remember going to one in Yorkshire and saying to everybody, as I said to a number of them, I'm used to going and speaking at public meetings. I don't usually have people paying money to come and hear me, and then buying the book afterwards. And I think the literary festival audience is a really interesting audience of people, very, very bright, who, and on the whole, I found very caring people who are, in a sense, looking for something that they don't get through the media. And if they're politically interested, they don't get through conventional parliamentary debate or media coverage of politics. which is often very sensational and personalized, and just want a discussion, not a dull discussion, but a proper discussion, an intelligent discussion where they can put their points of view and hear the answers from people like me and lots of others.
Do you think there's an appeal for like political books like yours, like the Rhino conspiracy and things like that, so with the elements of politics in with the fiction?
Well, it's a thriller first and foremost, but I don't want to put people off by thinking they're reading a political tome, because they're not. But it obviously covers politics and involves politics because of the political corruption that I describe behind poaching, in this case in South Africa, and the way that has damaged the country so terribly and grievously and painfully from my point of view, as somebody involved in the anti-apartheid struggle, whose parents, as I say, has sacrificed a lot. And if you think of Nelson Mandela's life, 27 years in prison in the prime of his life, and his story, the most remarkable person I've ever met. And I've met kings and queens and presidents and prime ministers the world over in my role as a government minister and as a member of parliament, and and the other things I've done. But he's the most remarkable person, standout person I've ever met. And so, yeah, there are politics in it, but it's politics that is part of life. That rather than people thinking they're reading a politics book, which they're not, they're reading a crime thriller.
No, it is very obviously a crime thriller, but I think that to me, when it got to those parts where there was politics woven into it, really made it stand out.
Good. Well,
because it was so well written. You obviously know so much about it. Like little hints at things, like there's bits where they go to the Commons bar and they're talking about like the real ale on tap and stuff. Even like it just felt so real and interesting. Right. And I think that made it stand out even more.
Okay, that's interesting. Yes, I mean there is a famous bar called Strangers Bar, because in the past, I mean, I helped to change that as a leader of the House of Commons. For example, the public gallery used to be called the Strangers Gallery, because although you were a citizen and a voter who put MPs like I was in Parliament, and it's your Parliament, really, people coming into it were called strangers. Anybody who wasn't an MP was a stranger. And there's this bar called the Strangers Bar, and it's got a terrace that is right alongside the Thames, and on a hot summer's evening, it's one of the nicest places in London to be. But they have a guest real ale, a different one every week, often 2 or 3. And MPs recommend from their constituencies their local real ales. And I'm a real ale fan, and I think the real ale industry needs to be supported. So yeah, that little vignette is actually true, as is the start where the MP is running to get to a vote in time, because you've got a limited time to vote, and he's literally sprinting down Whitehall. And that is all true. All the detail in that is exactly how it is.
Yeah, and you could tell that would be exactly how it was when you were reading it. And I think, I can't speak for everyone else. I'm just speaking for me as a reader. But for me as a reader, those bits brought the book to life.
Good. Well, I'm glad about that. I suppose, writers like Andy McNabb, for example, who writes about the SAS and so on, I mean, it's based on his own experience. And there are others like that. So in this sense, yeah, I mean, there are a number of people in politics who tried to write thrillers, some successfully. Jeffrey Archer's a classic example of that. And there are others, but it's something you've got to do with some care, I think, and not try and dress up a political book as a crime thriller or a novel, but actually it's really a non-fiction book dressed up. I mean, this isn't like that. This is a thriller with lots of political background in it, like it might be, as I say, the McNabb books are obviously based on his experience of working within the military, and you get others who write thrillers from their own experiences of their own lives. But then you get others who, I mean, Gerald Seymour, for example, is a very experienced thriller writer. I first met him in 1969-70 when I was stopping Springbok rugby matches, and he worked for ITN as a senior reporter, and he often interviewed me. And then he became an international reporter, and he obviously uses that experience in his thrillers to good effect. And that's true also if you read Sam Bourne, who in real life is Jonathan Friedland, the Guardian journalist. He writes a lot about American politics, and he was based in America for quite a long time as a correspondent in Washington. And so, that kind of real life experience comes through those fiction writers' books, and I suppose mine does too.
Do you have a favorite character that you created?
Well, I like a number of the characters. I like Tundi very much. I think she's you probably agree, is quite a feisty young woman, but
Yeah,
not
she's excellent.
She's very independently minded. She's not feisty in a sort of in-your-face sense, but she stands up for herself. She's not going to be messed around by either young men who are, after her or anybody else. And she is based also. I've made her a fictional granddaughter of a close friend of ours who actually was our maid, the family maid. Typically a white family in South Africa, still actually, but in the apartheid days especially, would have an African maid doing the cooking and the cleaning and sometimes looking after the children. Often the only way African maids could go into parks reserved for whites was when they were caring for young white children. And she became a close family friend, which was not the case for the relationship with most white families. But then my parents were very unusual and got involved in their work and helped them. And Tundi Majeka is projected as a granddaughter. So some of the stories she learns from her grandmother are based on real stories. So I like her, and I like the veteran as well, because he's somebody I know who was, as I say, one of Nelson Mandela's lieutenants. And there's a lot of me in him as well as him in him. So I suppose those are the two favorites, and those are probably the central characters of the book, I suppose, aren't they?
I particularly liked the guy who was a craftsman.
Oh yes,
who, without giving away a spoiler, is very integral in the sort of end game.
Yes, he lives in Pietermaritzburg, which Mahatma Gandhi, where there's a statue of Mahatma Gandhi in the center of Pietermaritzburg in the province KwaZulu-Natal, which is on the sort of eastern coast of South Africa, a very large province where the Zulu people come from. And he plays a very important role, but not a major one. And he's a craftsman. So you liked him, did you? Yes,
he was my favorite.
Was he? Oh, really? Oh, interesting.
He's my favorite character.
All right. Yeah. Well, that's interesting because I don't know anybody exactly like that, but I know people who could be like that.
And if you ever wrote more in the series, maybe consider a spin-off short story or novella about him and his background.
Oh, okay. Well, you're giving me lots of ideas and lots of things to do, Caroline.
Just telling you the ones I want.
Oh, by the way, Samantha was asking what other events are you looking forward to attending once we're able to. I'd really like to go and see my team play football. You may think I'm a sad man about that, but I'd like to do that because I enjoy that. And there's nothing like attending live sport. I mean, you can watch it on TV, but it isn't actually the same as being there. Similarly, like motor racing, you go to Silverstone, as we've been privileged to do. Elizabeth and I were both Formula One fans, and it's a great spectacle. It'd be very nice to start doing those things again, and to visit. I've been able to see my grandchildren, of whom I've got 7, once in the last 5 months, and I'd like to see them playing football, and including my granddaughters who are very good footballers, in their ones from 9 to 15, and the youngest one, who's 4, started playing football as well, and the grandsons are good footballers too. I'd like to see them more often. Just ordinary things like that. I think we all miss that. I'd like to be able to visit my mother-in-law, who's in a care home, and see her properly and more regularly, like Elizabeth and I were able to. It's very hard speaking down through FaceTime or WhatsApp, particularly because she's quite old and not well, and she finds it hard to relate to virtual technology. So just ordinary things like that.
Yeah. Someone here says, other than your football team, I think you're a great guy.
Pardon?
Someone on the stream says, other than your football team, I think you're a great guy.
sorry about that. Yeah, well, we can't all support the same football team, can we? But that was a story in itself. I mean, it's related to my childhood in South Africa, how I became a Chelsea fan, because when we knew we were moving to London, my younger brother Tom and I looked at a map of London, and we were football fans. Unusually for white South African youngsters, we were football fans rather than rugby fans, although I like rugby. And we knew about Chelsea, and this is 1965 when I was 15. We looked at this map of London, we didn't know anything about London, and we looked for the nearest football team, and Chelsea was one of the nearest. And so we became Chelsea fans from Pretoria and have been ever since.
I'm the child of a Yorkshireman. I'm a rugby fan.
You're a rugby fan, yeah. Is that rugby union or rugby league?
Both.
Right, yeah.
Unusually.
Yeah. I'm a Wales rugby fan. Big Wales fan.
We have 3 minutes left, so do you want to just remind people of your book?
Yes,
and where we can source signed copies and
okay,
things.
Yeah. Well, Caroline, thanks. There's another. Have a look at the cover, and it's The Rhino Conspiracy, published by Muswell Press, and it's available in bookshops this week. Signed copies available from Daunt's bookshop. There was going to be a proper launch on Thursday. Now there's a virtual launch, which you can come on, and I hope people enjoy it as you did. And it's very, very nice of you to have me on to your show. And I'm really, really pleased that you like the book so much. And that's important to me because obviously you read a lot of crime yourself, with you and your dad who run the crime club. So I regard it as quite applauded to have your endorsement for the book, and I hope others enjoy it too, because it's not intended to be, and it isn't a heavy book. It's an easy read, and it's the kind of book that I like to read. I hope, because I read thrillers because I like that kind of thing, and I hope people enjoy it and also get an understanding from it of the threat of poaching on the one hand and the political corruption and organized crime that lies behind it, and some of the characters who very bravely tried to protect the rhinos and protect the values of people like Nelson Mandela.
And once they've read it, if they want to go and give a donation, it's Save the Rhino.
Save the Rhino. I would strongly support. It's a charity supported by, I think he's one of their patrons or president, by Prince William as well, who, like Prince Harry's, very strong conservationist. So it's a great charity.
Wonderful. And then all that's left to say is thank you so much for coming on.
Well, thank you again, Caroline, for having me. I really enjoyed it, and delighted you enjoyed the book as well.